The Valley of Ashes. The first time anyone told me about the Coleman place, it was in the kind of hushed voice you reserve for confessions or curses. "Don't go down that road after dusk," old Mrs. Caldwell warned me, her milky eyes fixed on the tree line like she expected it to blink. "The air gets wrong down there, thick, like the earth still choking on something it couldn't swallow." I laughed then, a little too loudly, if I'm honest. But that night, standing on the ridge above the valley, I understood what she meant. The place didn't look abandoned. It looked exiled. The wind stopped at its borders as if even the air refused to trespass. The crumbling stone foundations of the old New Canaan community farm sprawled like the ribs of some buried giant, and in the center stood the Coleman barn, leaning, sagging, and yet somehow defiant. Its blackened timbers etched against a blood-orange sunset like the last teeth in a rotting mouth. They say time forgets, but time hasn't forgotten here. It's just biding its time. A kingdom carved from silence. In the winter of 1837, Elder Daniel Coleman stepped off his wagon into that silent valley and declared it chosen ground. The man was said to be made of sermons and bone, tall, thin, eyes like shards of ice chipped from some merciless glacier. He spoke of visions, of a heavenly order that would rise from this wilderness like a second Eden. To the weary families scraping by on failing farms across Ohio and Pennsylvania, he seemed like salvation wrapped in scripture. Coleman bought the 400-acre tract outright, paying in gold coins that glinted coldly in the winter sun. No one asked how a persecuted preacher had come by such wealth. People don't ask questions when they're starving. They just swallow hope like medicine and pray it works. Within months, families began arriving by the wagon load, their worldly possessions rattling like hollow bones in wooden carts. They came chasing a promise: shared labor, shared reward, shared redemption. Instead, they found Daniel Coleman, the gospel of hunger at first. New Canaan felt like a miracle. Cabins rose from the frozen ground. Fires crackled in communal hearths. Coleman himself worked beside his flock, hands raw and bleeding from hauling timber, his sermons spilling into the cold air with the cadence of prophecy. He preached from dawn to dusk, weaving scripture and firelight into something so intoxicating even skeptics found themselves nodding along. The people were exhausted but elated, drunk on purpose. But by the time spring bled into summer, something in Coleman's sermons shifted. He began to speak of purification, of the flesh as a cage that must be whittled down to free the spirit. Meals shrank to meager ladles of thin broth. Workdays stretched to 16 hours. "God tests those he loves," Coleman would murmur as men fainted in the fields and children cried themselves hoarse with hunger. The first death came in late summer. Thomas Henderson, father of 4, collapsed in the north field while swinging his axe. Coleman called it rapture by devotion. The others called it what it was, quietly when they were sure no one could hear: starvation. At his funeral, Coleman preached for 3 hours straight, voice echoing through the valley like thunder, trying to remember how to be human. When he finally fell silent, something in the crowd seemed to go out, like a lantern being snuffed. Splinters in paradise by winter, the cracks weren't cracks anymore, they were canyons. Coleman's family stood apart from the suffering they preached. His wife, Sarah, was never seen without crisp linen dresses and an expression carved from iron. Their children, Joshua, Rebecca, and little Ezra, moved through the settlement like silent shadows, untouched by the grime and exhaustion that bent everyone else double. The Colemans dined alone in the main house. Sometimes at night, laughter and music floated from its shuttered windows, soft, elegant sounds that didn't belong in this place of calloused hands and hollow eyes. Anyone who asked about it found themselves summoned for private counsel with Elder Coleman. They returned pale and trembling, eyes downcast, as if something inside them had been scooped out and quietly buried. When Mary Washington froze to death in her bed that December, her cabin's firewood stores mysteriously empty, Coleman said she'd been spared the coming trials. By spring, 7 more graves leaned in the wind behind the barn, each marked only by a nameless wooden cross. Coleman said their souls were ascending. Some whispered their souls had been harvested. The root cellar revelation Peter Miller was 14, restless, and reckless enough to poke holes in Coleman's story. While cleaning the root cellar one gray morning, he found a false wall behind the potato bins. Inside lay the missing pieces of the dead: watches, lockets, family Bibles, photographs, their lives. stripped down to trinkets and hidden like loot. Peter's hands shook as he carried a silver locket to Elder Coleman, demanding answers. Coleman listened silently, then placed a cold palm on Peter's shoulder and said only, "The Lord must burn the impurities from your soul, boy." Peter never made it back to his cabin. His mother found streaks of blood on the frozen path leading toward the woods behind the main house. Coleman told the community Peter had run away, overcome by weakness. But at night, some swore they could still hear him, small fists pounding from beneath the floorboards of the main house, fading with the sound of muffled screams. After that, no one questioned the elder, not aloud, but they all began sleeping lighter, whispers beneath the hymns by 1839. New Canaan had swollen to nearly 200 souls. The work routine became a machine of suffering, grinding down bone and will alike. Children as young as 8 were put to the plow. Everyone rose at 4 a.m. to the tolling of a bell Sarah rang from her bedroom window, the sound hollow and sharp as a cracked skull. They worked until their bodies begged for death and then worked some more. But it wasn't the work that hollowed them out. It was the nights. Each evening, Coleman gathered the community in the main hall for spiritual instruction. The air would turn suffocating as he preached until midnight. Mixing scripture with his own fevered doctrine, people stood until their legs buckled, confessing their sins in weeping voices while Coleman's eyes burned holes through their souls. Those who resisted disappeared. Sometimes they were sent on missions. Sometimes they were called home by the Lord. Always their cabins were emptied by dawn. The graves behind the barn multiplied like bad thoughts. So did the rumors. Some said the basement of the main house wasn't for storing grain at all. Some said that on certain moonless nights, if you stood near the cellar doors, you could hear chanting. Others swore it wasn't chanting. It was screaming. A silence that watches. By the time the winter of 1841 came clawing down from the hills, the valley was soaked in dread. Even the children had stopped laughing. The place that had once felt like heaven's doorway now felt like a throat about to swallow. But the worst part wasn't the deaths. It wasn't the disappearances or the sermons, or even the laughter that drifted from the Coleman house while the rest of the community starved. It was the watching, the sense that something behind those frost-glazed windows was always awake, always listening, and very, very patient, waiting for the last sliver of hope to snap. And as the snow began to fall that year, covering the nameless graves like a shroud, it did. The harvest of fear. The spring thaw of 1842 should have brought relief. Instead, it brought the smell, sweet cloying, impossible to ignore. It clung to the mist that crept through the valley, slid under cabin doors, and nested in people's hair. At first, everyone said it was just the wet earth, but Anna Thompson swore she saw freshly turned soil behind the barn on a morning when no digging had been scheduled. By nightfall, the smell had doubled, thick enough to make the children gag. That night, Elder Coleman's sermon was about sacrifice, about how the seed must die to give life. His voice, usually smooth as riverstone, cracked on the word die, and everyone in the hall flinched. They all knew. The graves were multiplying faster than the harvest. The Festival of Ashes Coleman announced the first annual spring festival as a celebration of the Lord's bounty. The announcement was met with cautious hope. There had been whispers of better rations, maybe music, perhaps even dancing. For one brief, foolish week, the community let itself believe in joy. But when the festival came, it was nothing like they imagined. Coleman opened the proceedings with a 6-hour sermon, his eyes blazing as if lit from within. He spoke of the impurities that had been purged from among us, and each time he said the word purged, his gaze lingered on one of the newer families who had arrived that winter. Then came the feast, if you could call it that. A single loaf of bread passed down the long table, broken by Coleman's hand and handed out like communion. Thin bowls of broth followed, one per family, barely enough to wet the bottom of the dish. When the meal was done, Coleman ordered everyone to gather outside by torchlight. The smell was waiting for them. Behind the barn, 6 wooden crosses stood in a perfect row, fresh earth piled at their bases. Coleman called them the Blessed, martyrs who had failed their spiritual tests and been returned to God. He made the community sing hymns until the torches guttered out. No one spoke on the walk back to their cabins. The silence felt louder than screaming. The children of the house that summer. Something shifted with the Coleman children. Joshua, now 17, had grown into his father's shadow. Tall, broad-shouldered, and cruel. He oversaw the work crews with a leather strap at his belt and a ledger in his hand, tallying every failure like a banker counting debts. Rebecca, 14, had taken to visiting cabins unannounced, slipping inside like a ghost. Sometimes she brought letters to read aloud, usually warnings from the outside world about war, famine, or plague. Sometimes she just stood there smiling faintly, as though listening to something no one else could hear. And then there was Ezra, 12 years old and dangerous in ways the others weren't. He was always in motion, a blur of pale hair and wild laughter. Animals went missing when Ezra was bored. Chickens with slit throats, a dog found drowned in the creek, once even a deer with its legs broken, left alive to thrash in the mud until Joshua put it down. Boys will be boys, Coleman would say, his tone light but his eyes sharp enough to cut. The Lord's Spirit burns fierce in that one. The families began keeping their children close at night. Letters never sent. By 1843, the community's last ties to the outside world had been severed. Rebecca Coleman took over all correspondence, insisting she would shield the flock from worldly corruption. Letters brought to her were opened, read aloud, and either approved or burned in the hearth. Some families went months without word from relatives back east, while others received suspiciously cheerful letters written in Rebecca's neat hand. Elizabeth Miller, Peter's mother, grew convinced her surviving children were next. She began hiding scraps of paper, writing desperate notes to her sister in Pennsylvania begging her to come. None were ever sent. One night she found her hiding place empty and a single word written on the wall above it in ash: confess. The next evening, Elizabeth was called before the entire community. Coleman accused her of harboring rebellion in her heart. She was made to kneel in the dirt while the congregation shouted her sins back at her. By the end, she was sobbing so hard she could barely speak. Elizabeth was never seen again. The cellar door in late autumn, a carpenter named David Chen was summoned to the main house. The cellar door, Coleman claimed, had been sticking. David was a quiet man, not prone to gossip, but when he returned from the house, his hands were shaking so badly he dropped his tools. That night he told Anna Thompson what he had seen. The door wasn't sticking. It had been bolted from the inside, and there were voices below. Low, wordless, but undeniably human. David swore one of them had called his name. Something in the walls. By the time snow began to fall again, the entire settlement felt like a trap. The cabins leaned closer to the main house as though gravity itself had begun to drag them inward. People started reporting noises after dark, scratching inside the walls, whispers under the floorboards, footsteps that circled their cabins and stopped just outside the door. One morning, a family was found gone. Not just gone, erased. The cabin empty, the hearth cold, even their clothes stripped from the pegs. Only one thing remained: a child's wooden doll, nailed to the doorframe upside down. Coleman told the community they had fled into darkness and ordered the cabin burned. The smell of smoke mixed with that ever-present sweet rot, until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. And then, just as the valley seemed on the edge of collapse, Coleman announced a renewal. A new year was coming. New souls were arriving, and with them, he promised, would come the great purification. The splintered choir, the winter of 1845, settled on New Canaan like a clenched fist. The cold was absolute, thick, heavy, more like stone than air. Smoke curled from cabin chimneys, sluggish and unwilling, as if even fire feared drawing attention, and beneath the ice-crusted silence something was stirring. Not the sound of defiance exactly, more like a hairline crack in a dam, faint but relentless. Because by then enough people had seen what became of the chosen. Enough children had vanished between dusk and dawn. Enough mothers had been forced to bury hollow boxes Coleman claimed contained their children's remains. Boxes too light to hold anything heavier than secrets. Hope was dead. But anger was still breathing. The woman who stopped praying. Anna Thompson was the first to stop praying. She had been kneeling every night for 8 years, since the day her husband's name was spoken. During a sermon as a cautionary tale, she had bowed her head as Coleman preached about purification and submission, her knees bruised and bloody from penance, but on the first night of that brutal winter, Anna simply didn't. While the others sank into the dirt, she remained standing, her eyes fixed on the Coleman family at the front of the hall. No one said anything, not out loud, but she saw the ripple pass through the crowd like the shadow of a hawk gliding over a field. Heads dipped lower. Shoulders tightened, and she saw Coleman see her. He didn't stop his sermon, didn't miss a word, but his pale eyes found her through the sea of bowed heads, and for the first time she saw something in them she had never seen before. Recognition, not of rebellion, of competition. The hidden ledger David Chen had always been invisible, which made him dangerous. A carpenter with a quiet laugh and calloused hands, he'd spent a decade building the structures that caged them all, the cabins, the fences, even the dais from which Coleman preached. He knew every joint, every nail, every knot in the bones of New Canaan. While repairing a sagging rafter in the main hall, David discovered a hidden compartment inside the podium itself. Inside was a slim leather ledger inked in Coleman's sharp surgical handwriting. It wasn't scripture. It was accounting, dates, names, possessions brought by each family upon arrival, and a single chilling word written beside most of them in red ink: harvested. When David closed the podium, his hands were trembling so violently he nearly dropped his hammer. He didn't tell anyone for 2 weeks, not until he saw the same word painted, small, discreet, on the underside of Anna Thompson's cabin door. The children taken in February. 3 children were taken from their parents for the Lord's work. Coleman announced it during the evening sermon as if announcing the weather. The children were 5, 7, and 9. They were not seen again. Their cabins were emptied overnight. Even their toys were gone, as though they had been scrubbed from existence. The next morning, tiny footprints led from the cabins toward the main house. Halfway there, the prints simply stopped. The snow was undisturbed for 20 feet in any direction, as if the children had been lifted straight into the sky. The whisper cabal, that was the breaking point. Anna gathered the grieving parents in her cabin, the shutters nailed shut, the cracks in the walls stuffed with rags. David came, clutching the stolen ledger like a holy book. Margaret Foster came, her face gaunt, her eyes feral since her husband's accident the year before. Sarah Martinez came, shaking with rage after her son's name vanished from the community rolls. And finally, timidly, Timothy Walsh came, a 15-year-old boy who had been born in New Canaan and carried its ghosts in his gaze. He had been working in the main house and whispered that he knew where the missing children had gone. He spoke of the rooms below, rooms where screams were swallowed by stone, where Coleman kept his failed vessels chained and starving, breaking them down until they either bent or vanished. That night they made a pact. They would gather proof. They would survive the winter. And come spring they would burn the valley clean. The house watches, but Coleman felt it, even as his sermons grew more fevered and incoherent. His pale eyes seemed sharper, slicing through the congregation like knives. Joshua began patrolling the cabins after dark, his boots crunching in the snow outside Anna's door. Rebecca hovered at the edges of conversations like a phantom, her smile too still, too knowing. And Ezra just stared, from rooftops, from rafters, from the tree line, grinning as though he could already see their plans ending. Some nights, Anna woke to find footprints outside her cabin, bare feet in the snow, circling and circling until they vanished into the woods. They hadn't even begun yet, and still, the Coleman family was tightening the noose, the choir of bones in march. The conspirators found their first undeniable proof. David, sent to repair a collapsing beam in the barn, pried up a section of the floor. Beneath lay a shallow pit filled with cracked bones, children's bones tiny and brittle as old bird nests. He covered it back up with shaking hands. Then he carved a small symbol into the beam above it, a crescent split down the middle. That night, as the community sang hymns under Coleman's burning gaze, Anna felt something stir in the air. Not hope exactly, not yet, but momentum. The valley had been silent for too long, and now it was listening. Beneath the house of silence there is a kind of quiet so complete, it stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like presence. That's what Anna Thompson felt as she stood outside the Coleman house on the moonless night in early April, 1846. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness you hear in a predator just before it strikes. Behind her, the cabins lay dark and lifeless, their residents pretending to sleep. Ahead of her rose the Coleman house, 3 stories of brick and black timber, its windows like sightless eyes, its chimneys exhaling thin threads of smoke as if it were breathing. Anna had always hated the house. Tonight she was going to open it up like a wound. The map of hollow places. David Chen had spent weeks charting the house's skeleton while pretending to repair it. He had memorized every hallway, every beam, every odd echo. Beneath the kitchen pantry, he'd found a trapdoor disguised under barrels of dried corn. It led down to a root cellar, and below that something else. The cellar's stone floor rang hollow when struck. David had pressed his ear to the cold rock. He'd heard humming, not the sound of voices exactly, more like a low, steady vibration, as though something deep beneath the house was singing to itself in its sleep. He drew a map in secret, etched on thin scraps of birch bark and hidden inside the hollow leg of Anna's table. Looking at it made her dizzy, as if the lines twisted when she wasn't watching. But she memorized them anyway, because if they could find the children, they could prove everything, the door that breathed. They moved on a night when the moon was nothing but a rumor. Anna, David, Margaret Foster, Sarah Martinez, and young Timothy Walsh slipped from their cabins like ghosts. They carried no lanterns, light felt like an invitation, and moved barefoot to muffle their steps. The kitchen door was unlocked. Coleman never locked his doors. Locks were for people who feared the world could touch them. Coleman had no such fear. They found the trapdoor beneath the corn barrels. Its iron ring was cold as a dead tooth. When David pulled it open, the air that rose from below wasn't stale. It was warm, damp, breathing. They descended into the root cellar. The earth walls sweated. Strange symbols were scratched into the stones, loops and spirals half erased, as though they'd been clawed away by desperate hands. And at the far wall, hidden behind a shelf of empty jars, was what David had promised them. A second door. Wood blackened with age, the grain swollen like muscle. It pulsed ever so faintly in rhythm with their hearts. The chamber of names, the door opened without a sound. That was somehow worse. Beyond lay a staircase spiraling down far deeper than the house should have allowed. The steps were slick with condensation, the stone worn smooth in the center by decades, no centuries of feet. At the bottom was a chamber lit by hundreds of candles jammed into cracks in the wall. Their flames leaned away from the intruders as though recoiling. The floor was covered in names, not written, carved. Thousands of them overlapping in dozens of hands, some fresh, some ancient, some half-effaced by claw marks. Anna saw her husband's name near the center, cut deep enough to crack the stone. Sarah Martinez found her son's name beside it, and beside his name was the word, broken, the choir in the dark. There were cells, 6 of them, iron-barred lining the far wall. 2 were empty except for gnawed bones. 2 held shapes that had once been human, now too thin and bent to stand. Their eyes shrank from the light. Their mouths worked silently as though chewing on invisible words. 1 cell held a child. Anna recognized her at once, Emily Foster, missing for 6 months. The girl's hair was white, though she was only 8. She stared at them with eyes that reflected the candlelight like an animal's. The last cell was covered in cloth. A heavy black curtain hung across its bars, nailed into the stone. Something moved behind it, slowly, wetly, and above it, carved into the stone lintel, was a single phrase in Coleman's sharp script, the first vessel. The ledger of flesh David found the table at the center of the room. It was covered in papers. Ledgers like the one from the podium, but far older. Some were in languages none of them knew. Some weren't in any language at all, just curling shapes that made their eyes water to look at. But the newest book was in Coleman's hand. It listed every birth in the community for the past decade, every death, and a column labeled harvested that matched them like pairs of shoes. There was another column too, integrated. Next to it, the initials of the Coleman children. The house awakens, that was when they heard it. A bell. Soft at first, distant, muffled like it was ringing underwater, then closer, louder, and with each toll, the stone under their feet trembled. The figures in the cells began to hum low, hollow notes that vibrated through their teeth. The black curtain in the final cell swelled outward, straining against the nails as though something vast was inhaling. Timothy dropped the ledger. The sound echoed like a gunshot, and from far above them came another sound, boots. Heavy, deliberate, descending the spiral stairs. They had found the truth at last, and it had found them back. The night of hollow bells, the boots were coming closer. Anna Thompson pressed her back against the clammy stone as the spiral stairs above them thudded under measured, unhurried weight. Not rushing, not searching, just arriving. David Chen grabbed Timothy by the collar and yanked him behind the ledger table. Sarah Martinez crouched near the cells, clutching Emily Foster's trembling body to her chest. Margaret Foster held a rusted iron rod in both hands, the whites of her eyes glaring like snow in torchlight. The bell tolled again. Deeper now, louder, like it was ringing from inside their skulls. And from the black curtained cell came a voice. The voice. That wasn't, it was not a human voice. It had words. Yes, syllables that coiled through the damp air like threads of smoke. But the tone was wrong, too deep and too high at once, like two voices speaking from the same throat in opposite directions. Anna felt it in her bones more than heard it. Vessels unbound, it said. Vessels returned. The figures in the other cells began to wail, low at first, then rising until it became almost song. Their voices were cracked glass, yet eerily harmonious, as if some hidden conductor guided their grief. The boots reached the bottom of the stairs. The son who smiled, Ezra Coleman, stepped into the candlelight. He was taller now, grown into the length of his limbs like a spider finishing its molt. His skin was pale as paper. His eyes glimmered like wet slate. He carried nothing, no whip, no blade, yet everyone stepped back instinctively. "Father said you'd come," Ezra said softly, "as soon as you remembered what you'd lost." Anna tried to speak, but her mouth felt packed with ash. Ezra tilted his head, bird-like. "Did you think this place kept you alive? It's been eating you." Slow, gentle, patient. And then he smiled. It wasn't the smile of a boy. It was the smile of something that had worn a boy-like clothing, and finally decided the disguise was unnecessary. The shattering David Chen hurled the ledger at Ezra's face. Ezra didn't flinch. The book stopped in midair, inches from his skin, then fell to the floor with a wet slap. Candle flames guttered sideways as if shoved by an invisible hand. Ezra raised one long finger. The cells burst open. The emaciated shapes inside did not stumble or crawl. They flowed. Like broken marionettes suddenly recalling the dance, they surged out in spasming jerks, hands like claws, mouths yawning too wide. Their eyes were vacant. Their movements were not run, whispered Timothy. No one argued. The house that closed. They tore back up the spiral stairs, boots slipping on slime. Behind them came the inhuman scrape of the half-dead climbing stone on all fours, their joints cracking like dry branches. The root cellar door slammed shut as they burst through it, though none of them had touched it. Barrels toppled, corn scattered like teeth across the floor. Anna yanked at the handle. It wouldn't budge. The entire house shuddered. Plaster rained from the ceiling. The walls seemed to flex, boards bending inward like ribs around a held breath. The hum David had once heard below the stone had risen to a keening vibration, trembling the nails in their beams. Somewhere above, a bell was tolling madly, though there was no bell in the house. There had never been a bell. Fire and Flight Margaret Foster grabbed a lantern from the kitchen wall and smashed it against the pantry shelves. Oil gushed, flames leaping like starving animals. "If it's alive," she snarled, "then let's see if it can burn." They bolted through the front hall as fire bloomed behind them, devouring the Coleman house with unnatural speed, racing along the beams as if it had been waiting. The floor buckled. Glass screamed from its frames. They burst out the front door into the cold night and froze, because the cabins were gone, every one of them, just black shapes of ash, like someone had taken a hot iron to the valley and branded it with absence. And out in the darkness stood hundreds of figures, men, women, children, faces blank, eyes hollow, standing silent as fence posts. The entire community, ringed around the house like mourners at a funeral they had already forgotten was theirs. the smile in the smoke behind them. The Coleman house burned. Through the roaring flames, a figure walked calmly down the front steps, Daniel Coleman, untouched by fire. His eyes glowed like cold iron pulled from a forge. He carried something in his hand, something black and wet and shifting like molten shadow given shape. It writhed, stretching toward the sky, and the bell's toll rose into a piercing shriek. Vessels, he intoned, voice echoing from everywhere at once, must be emptied. The hollow-eyed congregation stepped forward as one. Anna realized with a sick lurch that they weren't walking. They were floating. The ash crown, the fire painted the valley blood orange. The Coleman house had become a screaming skeleton of black beams and molten windows, yet it refused to fall. Flames climbed its walls in reverse, pulling downward instead of up, as though the fire were being devoured rather than fueled. Anna stood frozen at the tree line, her breath ghosting in sharp gasps, the heat blistering her cheeks. Behind her, Timothy whimpered. Margaret clutched a broken fence post like a spear. David's face was blank as bone, and from the ranks of the hollow-eyed congregation, Daniel Coleman stepped forward, still holding the black, writhing thing like a sacred relic. With each of his steps, the bell tolled, impossibly loud, though there was no bell at all. The first vessel opens, Daniel said. The others shall follow, the hollow ones. The congregation moved with him, their feet dragging inches above the ashen ground. Their mouths hung open, but no sound came out. Then all at once they inhaled. The air rushed from the valley like a storm sucked backwards. Anna's ears popped. The fire dimmed, starved of oxygen, shrinking into black cinders. The valley went completely silent. So silent Anna could hear her own heartbeat trying to escape her ribs. And in that silence, Rebecca Coleman's voice whispered directly behind her ear. "Run if you like." It breathed. "It won't matter. This place is inside you now," Anna spun. No one there. Only cold air and the distant crunch of snow cracking under invisible weight. The split David shoved the stolen ledger into Anna's hands. "If we die, someone has to know," he rasped. "Get it past the tree line. The land hates the forest. It won't follow you there." Anna's eyes met his. He knew he wasn't coming with her. The congregation surged like water breaking a dam. Hollow faces split into rictus grins, their jaws opening wider than bone should allow. Black light leaking from their throats. David ran straight at them, screaming, swinging a flaming branch. The figures folded over him like a wave. He didn't even have time to fall. Margaret yanked Timothy and Sarah toward the eastern ridge. "Move!" she shrieked, and Anna ran, clutching the ledger to her chest. Every step like tearing herself out of wet clay. Behind them, the Coleman house rose. Not collapsed, rose. The foundation cracked from the earth as if the whole building were standing up, dragging roots of black stone from the soil like tendrils, its windows glowing with cold fire. The first vessel at the center of the chaos. Daniel Coleman lifted the black shape above his head. It unfurled in the firelight like a shroud of liquid shadow. Within its folds flickered thousands of pale faces, children, mothers, fathers, all screaming silently. Anna glimpsed her husband among them, his mouth open in endless terror, his eyes begging. "The flesh returns to the seed," Daniel thundered. "The seed returns to the vessel." The black thing cascaded down over him like molten night. It sank into his skin, his veins glowing briefly silver, his eyes rolling white. When it cleared, Daniel Coleman was gone. Something else stood in his place, too tall, too thin, its limbs jointed wrong, its mouth running from ear to ear, packed with teeth that whispered like rattling coins. And in that new voice, layered, ancient, echoing from the stone itself, it spoke. "This valley was never yours." The bell cracks Anna, Sarah, Margaret, and Timothy reached the ridge as the thing that had been Daniel turned toward them. It raised one skeletal arm. The congregation rose with it, lifted by invisible strings, their bodies jerking like dolls. The bell's toll hit a frequency that made Anna's vision blur. Blood streaming from her nose, and then Timothy did something no one expected. He stopped, turned, and screamed the hymns. Not sang. Screamed them, backwards, syllables tumbling out like broken glass. His voice cracked the air. The congregation faltered mid-air, their heads twitching, their mouths clamping shut in unison. The bell's toll shuddered and split. A jagged silence tore through the valley like a blade. The thing that wore Daniel's skin reeled back, its limbs collapsing inward like a folding spider. "Go," Timothy howled, his voice raw. "Now!" Anna grabbed Sarah and Margaret and ran as Timothy's scream dissolved into white light. The ash crown. They didn't stop running until the trees swallowed them. Behind them, the valley howled. The sound was not fire or collapse. It was exhalation. A long, slow breath escaping from under the earth centuries old. Then, silence. When Anna finally dared to look back, there was nothing. No house, no cabins, no fire, only an empty scar of black soil and the faint ring of a cracked bell rolling across the hills. The state authorities came weeks later, spurred by rumors of smoke and refugees. They found nothing but charred earth. No bones, no ruins, not even ash. Anna gave them the ledger. They sealed it in a courthouse vault and declared the matter closed, but she never went home. None of them did. They scattered across the country like seeds in a cold wind, each carrying the same unspoken knowledge. The valley let them leave. It would not let them go. The Mask of Righteousness, decades later in 1894, a new farming commune appeared in rural Kentucky. Its founder was a thin man with pale eyes and a scar across his throat, though he spoke with a boy's laugh. His name was Ezekiel. He preached harmony. He promised salvation. And on quiet nights, the locals whispered they could hear a bell tolling from deep under the earth. Even though no bell had ever stood there. And that, my friend, is the end of the macabre history of the Coleman family, a sinister tale. The valley got its due, but the question still lingers like a cold breath on the back of your neck. Did the Colemans die that night? Or did the valley simply wear them somewhere else?